first to introduce Louise Hand. She's a Senior Career Officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and currently seconded to the Department of Climate Change. Prior to her appointment as Ambassador for Climate Change in 2009, she was Minister and Deputy Head of Mission at the Australian Embassy, Jakarta, from 2005 to 2009. Louise has served overseas as Ambassador to Cambodia and in a number of other overseas missions. Louise.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm going to do my best to stick to that timetable. I never go over time, but seeing that I know both Frank and Steve, I'd rather like to bore them rigid as a treat. But it's a pleasure to be invited to speak in this company where I think we can all assume a reasonably high level of understanding of these subject areas. I want to talk to you about the state of international climate change negotiations, which are much more multifaceted than probably many people realise. And I'm just going to quickly put it into the context of the domestic situation in Australia first, which I think emphasises for everybody why it's so important that Australia is engaged and is an active participant in global negotiations of all kinds on climate change. So where are we? The climate is changing. We know this. Global surface temperatures have risen over the past century. The last decade was the warmest decade on our records. When I speak to, I often find myself in the company of rather sort of hairy-chested deniers in Australia. And sometimes I even get, quite sort of, horrifying questions from the floor. And I tend to refer people to the Bureau of Meteorology's website. I love that website. I don't know if others of you use it, but it's wonderfully deadpan, and it has no sort of ideological bent. It just has an unremitting and remorseless series of figures and statistics and trends. And for anyone who thinks this is all a load of codswallop, I always recommend them to that website. Anyway, so the climate's changing, we know that. We're also recording an increase in carbon dioxide concentration in the Earth's atmosphere, which has now reached 390 parts per million. Remember that 390. This is much higher than what's called the natural range of between 172 to 300 parts per million, which existed in the atmosphere for the last 800,000 years. This graph shows the steady upward trend. So there's a very high degree of scientific certainty that this has human origins in the change. Now the science is also increasingly certain that unless we take action, the consequences of climate change will be severe. And if that doesn't move Australians, I often like to remind them it will also be expensive. If we fail to limit global greenhouse gas emissions, global temperatures could rise by up to 5 or 6 degrees Celsius above 1990 by the end of this century. A temperature rise of this magnitude, I'm afraid I can't get this thing started to move. Does anyone know how to work it?
You've got a window open. Just close that. Just click on the mouse and
there. It's nicely horrifying, so it's worth seeing. A temperature rise of this magnitude would be dramatic. There would be significant and ongoing rises in sea levels, heat waves, bushfires and droughts, disruptions to ecosystems, including the extinction of many species. There would be adverse effects on human health, including disease threats and more deaths of the vulnerable during heat waves. One of the major consequences of a changing climate is changes to the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, including drought, heat wave and floods. The Economist recently referred to this as freaky weather, where you have slush in the Arctic and snow in California. From the Australian perspective, I'd ask you to think about Dorothy McKellar's favourite quote about the sunburnt country and just pop it onto steroids. Although it's not possible to attribute specific extreme weather events to climate change, the recent things that occurred around Australia over the summer are completely consistent with projections from the climate models. Now, in terms of Australia's national interest, which is where we define our action on climate change. I'd like to be quite hard-headed and squarely consider it in those terms. As an island, large, with not much population and a dry centre on the far side of the planet, we're very vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. As a nation, we face social, environmental and economic costs from unmitigated climate change. When we consider the science, when we consider the cost-benefit analysis, the overall message is clear that we need to get on with the action. So the government's taken on board the best available science, combined with the best available estimate of the costs of prevention. The Ghana Review, which has had some more publicity recently, was commissioned to recommend climate policy frameworks for national prosperity. An update of the review has recently taken place, and many of you will have seen the press on it. So based on the science, based on Ghana, based on economic policy, the Australian government has settled on a global carbon dioxide concentration of no more than 450 parts per million, remembering that we're at 390 now, roughly corresponding to a temperature rise of less than 2 degrees. 2 degrees is quite important in terms of the climate change international negotiations, because that's the figure that after a great deal of debate we've been able to get the international community to settle on as a goal, 2 degrees and 450 parts per million. So to get there, because emissions are continuing to grow, every country, including Australia, has to pull its weight. And that includes all major emitters. And their actions, the actions of major emitters, must become part of the global solution. These aren't small changes. This is a transformation of the world's economic systems, and it needs to decouple production and development from pollution. And you'll find in many of the arguments that are put back to us about this from India and China and Indonesia and the other enormous developing countries, South Africa, Brazil, is that they want their chance at development in the same way that Western countries have. And we need to find ways increasingly, and they are in many cases themselves, of having that particular development and a path towards out of poverty, decoupled from pollution. Now, I really do want to take you down into the weeds of multilateral negotiations, particularly Cancun, but where we did actually get the building blocks of this particular regime. But I wanted to talk about a little bit about Australian effort. I'd like you to know, as the person who leads the Australian delegations, often very large, to international negotiations and have done for the last couple of years, that Australia tries very, very hard to play a constructive role, bringing what we do well, which is, we have very good lawyers, we have very good negotiators, we have good scientists, and we pull all this together in an effort to provide a distinctive Australian contribution that might help us to get towards agreements on a very large and forward-looking scale. Now, Australia has announced, and this was in a 4 May statement last year, a range of targets. Steve was right there in the room when it was being developed, so we can call on him later. But the government has agreed to, and this holds, an unconditional 5% reduction in emissions for Australia on 2000 levels by 2020. There's a further range that goes up to 25%, which depends on the kinds of action the rest of the world is taking. Along with that target, the Australian government is also doing a whole suite of practical things, and many of you will know about that. It's renewable energy and carbon farming and lots and lots of work on adaptation for the parts of Australia that have been adversely affected already, for example, with sea level rises. But the most important thing this year, and it will be very, very important to get this right if we're to get to our 5% target, even at that level, will be the price on carbon. And we're really looking to that price on carbon to link Australia to the rest of the world for carbon trading, which will be absolutely crucial in changing behaviour, establishing new investment patterns, looking at the science of all of this. So we've really got our fingers crossed that the Prime Minister will be able to get her particular policy through on the price on carbon. Now, as I've said before, to get to the 450 degrees, Australia is quite a small player in this. We're an important player because we have the highest per capita emissions, one of the highest per capita emissions in the world. And it's terribly important, given that figure, that we're part of a global solution. But at the same time, in terms of the overall emissions profiles, other countries are much bigger. And of course, the first of them is China, which has now overtaken the US as the world's #1 emitter. So we can't do this alone. We absolutely have to have the US, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia. We have to have them all in. And we have to have them all in a regime that works for them. And I think this is a really important sort of psychological and political transition from the Kyoto Protocol, which has had quite a narrow range of countries in a very, very compliance-focused regime. I think we need to be transitioning to something that makes it absolutely possible for all those countries where the emissions are actually coming from to put their efforts down for some scrutiny. So let's have a quick look at China, now overtaken the United States as the world's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. We can see that the government of China is positioning itself to be the world leader on clean technology, including wind and solar. It's also introduced a suite of energy efficiency measures for buildings, appliances and vehicles. It's after increasing its forest cover, having been a logger for so long, it's now on an upward swing of forestry, by 40 million hectares by 2020. It's also considering expanding its existing carbon pricing mechanisms. I just want you, if you don't know that, China actually has a price on carbon, and it's hoping to expand that particular set of measures to achieve its environmental targets. Now, these aren't glim promises coming out of China. They're embedded in the Chinese 5-year plan. And for those of you who follow Chinese politics, there really isn't anything much more binding on this planet than a Chinese 5-year plan. So when the Chinese say they've got this embedded in their domestic 5-year plan, I think the rest of the world can look on this with some certainty that those particular emissions reductions will actually be achieved. And because they're such a big emitter, if China is able to reach its goals, which are quite spectacular, the reductions in emissions intensity of 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2020. For a developing country, that's quite a significant reduction in emissions intensity. It's not an overall total economy goal. It applies to a sector, but we're not criticising. This means that emissions globally will be affected by that change in Chinese behaviour. Second one is the United States. Now, if you believed everything you read in the papers, you might think the US are doing nothing. That's just simply not true. The US took a target last year, the year before last, 17% reduction, that had the worst time ever in getting that through, as all of you will have seen. But they've not stepped away from that target, and the others, those of you who watch the US and its behaviour over time, politically and economically, will know that it's absolutely masterful at reinventing itself and reinventing its approaches. Now, after the US midterm elections last year, it became absolutely clear that the US were never going to be able to get their climate legislation through their political system. It just wasn't going to happen. But that didn't mean that Obama or his team stepped away from that goal. They started looking at other ways to do it, through regulation, through domestic measures, through action in separate states. And they've, if you listen carefully, you'll hear the language has changed from the climate change catastrophising, and it's moved to energy security, jobs, innovation, not letting China get ahead. And all of that is code for climate action. So, and I think if any of you also heard a little bit from Obama's State of the Union speech, he put it in classically American terms. He referred to the Chinese economic response on climate change and said that the US had to keep up, and this was a second Sputnik moment. So he sort of invoked the machismo of American research on that particular thing. Now, many countries with smaller emissions profiles than the United States and China are acting on climate change as a stimulant to economic growth. If you look at India, which has introduced energy efficiency trading schemes to cover 700 companies for its most energy-intensive industries. This, of course, sets up a whole raft of economic incentives. And we have carbon trading schemes all over the place, including New Zealand, European Union. There's bilateral ones between the US and the Latin American countries proposed. And when the Australian government reforms our economy to bring in a carbon price, it won't be alone. And in fact, those connections to international markets will be quite crucial.